Jesus said, before you do anything, before you pray for anything, before you pray for forgiveness, before you pray for daily bread, before you pray for your finances to be turned around, before you pray for that child, before you pray for that family member, give God honor. Hello and welcome to Christ Church's Leadership Podcast. I'm Charles Kyker, your host today. We've been in we call it a mini-series, but it's been a series on honor and the importance of honor. And in a little bit, I'll talk in a deeper way about the deficit in our culture today, the deficiencies that we have with this very theme, this very word. But I want to begin with a question. When's the last time you've wrestled with God? Let me go a little deeper. Have you ever wrestled with God? You see, most of the time, our spirituality is incredibly trivial. In fact, it's immature. In fact, it's quite childish and childlike, because we tend to wrestle with ourselves, our vanity, our ego. We constantly compare ourselves with other persons spiritually. If we find somebody a little less qualified in certain areas of whether it be prayer, whether it be service, whether it be simply their own sense of accomplishment and their spiritual walk or their gifts and talents, we feel a little better about ourselves. But rarely are we willing to go deep in our faith by comparing ourselves with God, by literally saying, I have no business comparing myself to anyone else. It's an enterprise of vanity. I really should say, how does my life line up with Jesus's life? How does my compassion line up with Jesus's compassion for others? How does my ability to forgive and to be set free from bitterness and anger, how does that line up with Jesus? One of the most remarkable things that Jesus left us, it's been said that he left a cross, an empty tomb, and he left us a prayer. Of course, we believe he left us much more than that. And thanks be to God for his disciples whom he personally chose that left us much of the New Testament. But in this prayer that he was asked to give by his disciples, it's interesting how the Lord's Prayer actually begins. Jesus puts in perspective in the Lord's Prayer this magnificent and tremendous understanding of who God is and how we are to pray to God. So we begin in Matthew 6, verse 9, where he says, pray like this, Our Father in heaven, may your name be kept holy. Those two things juxtaposed to each other. First of all, he's in heaven, so he's majestic. He created the heavens and the universe, so God in heaven, but he calls him Father. So that name Father personalizes, and it personalizes God. He calls him Abba, is the actual term that's used. Abba is the word that, like we would use daddy. It's an endearing term. You're my Abba. And Abba can also and does mean that I'm one of many. I'm part of a family. So when you pray, Our Father in heaven, our Abba in heaven, you're praying to Abba. You're praying to this one who's created the heavens and the universe, this majestic God, but you're also personalizing it and calling God Daddy. And in the context of calling God Daddy, you're part of a family. Now, when he shows honor to the Father, he teaches us to honor God. He teaches us to show honor to the Father. Notice that in this prayer, Jesus could have begun the prayer any way he wanted to. any way he wanted to. And I don't want you to miss this, because if you miss this, you're going to miss God. And I don't want any of you to miss God. And that's a strong declaratory statement, but I'm just saying, listen to how Jesus puts this. He puts the honor of God before the coming of the kingdom. He puts the honor of God before praying for our sins to be forgiven. He prays for the honor of God, that his name would be hallowed, before we ask for daily bread. He puts the honor of God before all of these other petitions, because to begin with the honor of God is to set our hearts and our minds aright with what it means to be in a sacred place, in a sacred space called prayer. You see, it comes first because it's the divine gateway to God's presence. It comes first because it's the divine gateway to God's presence. Now, if Jesus models prayer that way, to honor God first is the gateway to his divine presence, then should you and I not see honor as one of the greatest characteristics of our spiritual lives and our spiritual growth? Yet, contrary to that reality, it's one of our greatest deficits. The absence of honor is our greatest deficiency among all spiritual virtues today in the Christian church. What are the foes of honor in our lives and our culture? What are the foes? What are the enemies? Just want to name a few. I believe there are many. But let's concentrate on a few. First of all, it's our familiarity with the unclean and the unholy. It's our familiarity with the unclean and the unholy. Folks, you can be standing at a grocery store and look at a magazine now, and there are burlesque pictures of half-clothed people, half-clothed women, and you get on this device, and you're scrolling along trying to see what your friends are up to, and you're on Instagram, and all of a sudden something pops up, and I'm like, where did that come from? I don't want any part of that. So I go back and like all the Billy Graham and all of the Mother Teresa and all of the chosen videos I can, so I can push the algorithm to something else. Folks, we're too familiar with sexual lust. We're too familiar with greed. We're too familiar with vanity. We're too familiar for self-exaltation that we've literally stepped away from this awe of God. It's an enemy, this familiarity. We flirt with temptation. We don't flee. Paul says, if you're being tempted, he says run. He literally says run in the New Testament. We don't run. We sit around and wink at it. We flirt with it. We say, I'm stronger than that. I can have one drink and quit. So what? My friends are cussing, but I'm not taking God's name in vain. But have you ever thought about saying, hey, I'm not here to be a prude, but can I just say how much God loves you and how much it hurts God that you just took his name in vain? We are so familiar with the unclean and the unholy that we've kind of hardened ourselves with the awe and the honor of God. The second foe is our own conceit and self-sufficiency. Our own conceit and self-sufficiency, and a lot of it's false. Let's be candid. Let's put the cards on the table. We think we're so smart now, and of course we've got AI, artificial intelligence, and now they're talking about the incredible capacity of that and what's possible with that, and we're climbing the ladder scientifically. And hey, we've explained a lot of the myths away, haven't we? Jupiter doesn't throw lightning bolts down anymore. Thor, when you hear thunder, it's not Thor pounding his hammer. We're not like the folks that lived in the caves and the caverns of culture and society thousands of years ago that had all of these superstitions. We've explained them all away. Or have we? There's some things we can't explain. We can't explain in the Middle East right now. We can't explain Jesus making appearances to women in the Muslim world who are praying and crying out for God for the healing of a child that's dying. And Jesus makes a Christophany, he makes an appearance, and he tells the woman, I'm going to heal your child. And the child is healed. And then she meets another woman that has had a similar experience. This is happening all over the Middle East right now. And they reach into their garments and they pull out a cross. And they've seen Christ. And then they put the cross back in for fear that somebody might see that they now have an allegiance to the one who's risen from the dead, the one who is the life-giving force of the universe. We've explained it all away. We have knowledge. We have power. Or do we? Our souls and all of this knowledge and all this intellectualism, our souls are still yearning for the wonder of God. I think the third greatest foe, and of course, like I said, there's many. You could probably produce your own list. The greatest foe of honor is our practical atheism. Our practical atheism. Now, there are several people in the last 20 or 30 years that have written books on the theme practical atheism. You can call it different synonyms, but it was a term that Clovis Chappell, he coined it in 1934. Practical atheism. He was one of the premier preachers, not just in Methodism, but in all of mainline Christianity. He was the Andy Stanley, the John Maxwell in the 1930s, 1940s. He published over 27 or 28 books. But Clovis Chappell says, when white-souled Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, when he heard the seraphim singing, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, he at once put his lips on the dust and he cried out, unclean, unclean, unclean. I'm a man of unclean lips. When John on the island of Patmos caught a vision of the risen Lord, he said, I fell at his feet as if one who is dead. We've lost the wonder and awe of God. We've just lost it. We're practical atheists. Oh, yeah, I believe there's a God. Yeah, I love God. I go to church and I love God. But when's the last time you fell at his feet? In absolute awe and wonder. And again, I'm going to push you on this. When's the last time you've wrestled with him? Maybe a better way to say it or ask it is, when's the last time you've been so aware of God that you allowed God to have the wrestling match? You see, I believe God wants to have a wrestling match with each of us, but if he thinks our heart's too hardened, if we think our head is too puffed up with itself and too intellectually astute, that we don't allow for his wonder, we don't allow for his awe. If he's going to wrestle with us and we're just going to try to explain him away, or we're just going to keep running from him or avoid, why would he wrestle with us at all? I think it's interesting that before we get to Genesis 33, we have Genesis 31. And Genesis 31 is the whole preparation, and the early part of Genesis 32 is the whole preparation of Jacob, knowing that he's going to have to face his brother, who 20 years ago said, if I can ever get my hands a hold of him, I'm going to kill him. In fact, verse 41 of chapter 27 says, as soon as he realized that Jacob had stolen not only his birthright, but also his blessing, he began immediately plotting of how he was going to kill his brother after his father's death. So scheming and overflowing with bitterness and anger and hatred. And the last words that Jacob heard was his brother yelling and screaming of how he was going to kill him. So 20 years goes by, and Jacob kicks into old Jacob, the hill puller, the schemer, the creative one, the ADHD, warp factor 10. He would be an entrepreneur today. He'd probably be more wealthy than Elon Musk ever thought about being, because he'd find a way, because he found a way to cheat Laban, or he found a way to scheme so that he could end up owning more livestock than his father-in-law. I mean, this guy was creative. I mean, when God blesses somebody, he blesses them. And Jacob was blessed, and Jacob had this creativity. But he also had this reality that his brother really almost had a right to kill him because he deceived him, and he deceived his father. You see, Jacob knew in his heart he had dishonored his brother, he had dishonored his father, and he dishonored God. But for whatever reason, he didn't want this to be the end, and so he sent gifts on ahead, livestock. He sent servants on ahead. And he was more or less trying to bribe Esau's affection. But between Genesis 31 and the first part of 32 and Genesis 33, when they finally meet, between that is this wrestling match. And I'm not going to read all of it, but let's go to Genesis 32, 22 to 31. It says, during the night, Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives, his 2 servant wives, and his 11 sons, and he crossed the Jabbok River with them. And after taking them to the other side, he sent over all of his possessions. This left Jacob all alone in the camp. And the man came and wrestled with him until his dawn began to break. And when the man saw that he would not win the match, he touched Jacob's hip and wrenched it out of its socket. Then the man said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. What is your name? The man asked. And he says, I am Jacob. Your name will no longer be Jacob, the man told him. From now on, you will be called Israel, because you have fought with God and with men and have won. Please tell me your name, Jacob said. The angel replied, why do you want to know my name? The man replied. Then he blessed Jacob there. Then Jacob named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For he said, I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. Jacob wrestles with God, and he goes away limping. Yet he's a new person. Jacob grabs a hold of the man, or the angel, and he holds on to him, and he won't let him go. And the angel says, let me go. And he says, I will not let you go until you bless me. Because you see, I'm wrestling with this past. I'm wrestling with this reality that I have dishonored my brother. I did dishonor my father. And I feel a need to make things right with God. And in this wrestling match with his soul and wrestling match with God, he says, I will not let you go until you bless me. And the angel, of course, had thrown his hip out of joint, but then the angel finally blesses him. So this limping Israel, who used to be called Jacob, limps his way up to his brother, but he's a different man now. You see, you and I, as mentioned, we seem to wrestle with everything in life except God. We'll choose to wrestle everything else to the ground instead of being willing to wrestle with God. We'll wrestle with our conscience. We'll wrestle with our sense of worth or value. We'll wrestle, where am I in life? And we compare ourselves with other people who are in other professions or other businesses. And we just wrestle. And sometimes we wrestle so much we can't even sleep at night. We have to get pills and prescriptions just to be able to sleep because we wrestle with anxiety and stress. I bet when Jacob, now Israel, went to sleep that night, I bet he slept like a baby. Except he probably had to sleep on another side. His hip was probably still hurting. But now after wrestling with God, he walks away with a limp, but he has a new heart. And he has a new commitment of honor to God. And I believe with my whole heart that when Esau finally saw him on the road, he didn't see the old Jacob. I just don't think he saw the old Jacob. And what was also beautiful is Jacob didn't see the old Esau either. I don't know if Esau wrestled with God, but after 20 years, instead of allowing the bitterness and anger to grow and take him over, so that his first move would have been to grab a sword and run it through his brother Jacob, Esau decided to go up to him and kiss him on the neck. Do you know Peniel means face of God, or I've wrestled with God. I've seen God face to face. And so whenever Esau kisses Jacob on the neck and they embrace and they hug and they weep, when Jacob looks back up into Esau's face, the face of a brother who has hugged him and embraced him instead of killed him, Jacob looks up and says, when I look into your face, I see the face of God. I see the face of forgiveness, because that's what God looks like. But also see the face of honor, because you've honored me today with the kiss on the neck. And whether or not you and I ever decide to honor God, God has already honored us. God has made us in God's image. He's created us in his image, male and female. And he's called us into a relationship with him. He's called us to live our lives fully for him. And I believe to honor God is our first and foremost act of prayer. It should be our posture. Jesus said, before you do anything, before you pray for anything, before you pray for forgiveness, before you pray for daily bread, before you pray for your finances to be turned around, before you pray for that child, before you pray for that family member, give God honor. Because if you learn to honor God, it'll become second nature that you'll start to honor your spouse. If you learn to honor God, it'll become second nature that you'll learn to honor your family member. If you learn to honor God, then it'll become second nature that you honor those you work with and those you serve, those you're in ministry with, even when they don't deserve it. You choose to honor because God has honored you. And I believe God's called us to a life of abundance, a life of service. But first and foremost, Jesus says, learn to honor God. Pray for that supremely. But here's the good news. You get to call God Daddy. Honor Daddy. Because Daddy has sure honored you. And Daddy has called you to a place of new life. And I want to urge you, don't run away from the wrestling match. When's the last time you've wrestled with God? Have you ever wrestled with God? You don't know what you're missing. Thank you for joining us for the podcast today. Look forward to seeing you again.